The Inquisition is one of the most enigmatic elements of Pathologic's world, which is obviously saying quite a lot, and each iteration of them only confuses me more. The organization represents the outer rim of Pathologic's world. They are analytical geniuses, but deeply limited thinkers, capable of greatness in their capacity to critique and curtail the world to meet their ends. At the same time, they seem to have a boundless scope of knowledge. I can't help but think that the Inquisition represents the interests of our world in the game world. You've probably had a lingering suspicion that the Inquisition is aware of the game around it, and we're gonna dive into just how likely that theory is. In some ways, they're a pretty pitiable lot, plucked out of childhood and pushed into a society of secrets, intrigue, and ideas that they can understand, but never contribute to. They have the minds of genius mathematicians, philosophers, writers, but lack creativity, in the most literal sense of the word. They are given endless political power, but this comes at the expense of perfection. They have no freedom to fail, and their knowledge of fate makes them, well, fatalistic. They have a prescience about how the exact current of events will result in their deaths. This video is about the Inquisition. Nominally. It's been about many things in many iterations, but I slowly realized that these other things required an in-depth understanding of the Inquisition that I didn't yet have. So this is where we begin a much longer conversation. Unless, Pathologic 4 somehow comes out in a month, and I end up spending 1,000 hours getting distracted by that. This is going to be a largely speculative video about what kind of organization the Inquisition is, what it stands for, where it comes from, and in what reality it can most accurately be said to exist within. Don't worry, it'll make sense. Maybe. As I read through the corpus page of the defunct Pathologic website and other obscure sources, I developed this murky headcanon around the group. After a while, I couldn't parse through what I'd read and failed to record, and what connections my brain made on its own. It felt like researching history, actually, where different interpretations of the same events means that some facts are just kind of lost now. Most people in history preferred to propagate their agenda, and too few focused on just taking inventory. Part of the recreation of events is just speculation, and that is definitely intentional. Look at the way this entry on the site is written. What was so horrible about the caravan, or family of Diamond Ace as they call themselves? If we were to compile all the rumors and doubtful reports, we could imagine that they were either some vile demons or death cultists. Apparently, it was quite a large roaming circus. What do you mean, apparently? And why are you asking rhetorical questions in a written piece? The last paragraph is particularly notable for its strong character-like voice. All this loathsome forgery, lie, and hypocrisy. How is it that everyone pretending to be someone else? Why is nobody daring to say the truth about themselves? How do we fight this? How do we live with this now? Who are you talking to, and who's we? I'm not a part of this in any way. This isn't written in the voice of an omniscient narrator. We have to imagine that some observer within the world is discussing the events that took place with incomplete knowledge. And so, we will do our best to stick to the facts as they are presented, but we may simply have to accept the fact that facts are a matter of some flexibility in this regard. These excerpts are from a piece on the massacre of the Diamond Ace caravan. This event took place some years before the plague in the town on the Gorkin River. We're told that the evil deeds of this caravan, including mass murder, torture, and the kidnapping and trafficking of hundreds of children, scarred the collective psyche of the nation. It seems to me that this may have incited a period of extreme governmental control over intellectuals and artists, anyone with an idea that might have been dangerous. The caravan was a circus. They were a nomadic band of artists and performers. They were frightening in part because they were somewhat untethered from traditional life. They weren't tied to the land nor generational trades, and were therefore unpredictable. Strangers everywhere they went. And unlike most times when one encounters a stranger, which results in nothing all that notable, these particular strangers were monstrous people. Thus, there came immense pressure from all angles of society applied to anyone practicing free artistry. We know that this idea of free artistry is often considered in direct opposition to the Inquisition. In Pathologic 2, Andre spots Aglaya's antagonism for the polyhedron from a mile away. though he only vaguely knows of Aglaya. In Pathologic 3, Anna Angel, who is a former member of the Caravan, is so terrified of the Inquisition that she tries to bump off Dankowski, the only licensed doctor in a plague-ridden town, because she perceives him as one of their lackeys. And she's an obsessive germaphobe and hypochondriac, which should really give you a sense of what she was willing to lose by offing Daniil. I speculate that this led to the creation, or perhaps institutionalization, of the Inquisition. In the article I've been referencing, we're told that the actions of the secretive service were deemed insufficient for capturing the Caravan. Their knowledge always seemed to be outdated. It might have been in such an environment that the all-seeing mind of the Inquisition might have been desirable. It wasn't just the deeds of the Caravan that were considered dangerous, it was any idea that couldn't be audited before being implemented. It was in this political climate that Daniil Dankowski had to fight to create the Thanatica. He's a difficult man to like in many ways, but you gotta hand it to him for making a project like that happen in a very adverse social setting. We also learn that he's 28 in this game. Can someone please kill me? Farhad was the eldest of the Oneira techs at the age of 31, which is an age I'm about to surpass. So that's fun. The persecution of Daniil's work implies that there was a gradual process of natural laws taking on a more ontological meaning. Yes, the crimes of the Caravan are unnatural by a certain definition of the word, but they are not impossible. The fact that the country punished them with such brutality is evidence that laws aren't the basic standard to which we hold people's actions. Pathologic 3 actually offers some interesting commentary about this by the Lord of Justice himself, Georgi Kane. But let's not open that can of worms just now. I promise that we'll talk about the way the Canes interact with the idea of justice in a later video, okay? It'll be complex and infuriating, and we'll all get to hate on poor Georgi together. Merriment will ensue. The people involved in the Caravan were all killed indiscriminately, whether or not they were complicit in its crimes. In fact, many never lived to see trials. Some were beaten and tortured during the interrogation. These actions are almost definitionally against the idea of a lawful punishment, even without knowing the exact laws of the empire in which the town is located. How do you know if someone has committed a crime if you don't try them? And yet, for these acts, they were praised by the populace. I wonder if this general sense of unnaturalness eventually became conflated with this idea that we learn about in Pathologic 3 of the impossible. Of course, it's ridiculous to punish someone for flying without any mechanical support, but is it not equally as baseless to kill criminals before even determining if they are criminals? It's like there's this visceral sense of wrongness that the Inquisitors feel the need to stomp out. However this progression happened, the Inquisition serves a social role for the people. They reflect an intuitive revulsion for anything untamable, be it a circus with no moral tethers, or a phenomenon that cannot be explained given the laws of the universe as we know them. This last bit is a sticking point for Daniil, and it's never sufficiently addressed to my liking either. In Pathologic 3, Mark Karminski defines an impossible object as a thing that cannot exist, based on the law, being
that which defines the shape of reality, the sum of facts it consists of, as well as the potential opportunities for its development. By virtue of having free will, people sometimes make attempts to break the law. In most cases, futile, but on some rare occasions they achieve a certain degree of success. At the seams, the tears in history's fabric.
The Bachelor responds in the moment by saying that the Inquisitor has contradicted himself. If the law defines reality, then how can it be broken at all? And the Inquisitor's response? Basically a tautology.
It's impossible to break the law. That's why its breaches are called impossible deeds. If they take material form, they're called impossible objects.
It's called dance theater. I understand what you're saying. I can hear you. I don't know what you're saying.
Dance theater.
Oh. So it's theater, but dance.
Yes, there's a lot of dancing, but it's very theatrical.
Are you trolling me? You're just saying the words dance theater in new formations and giving me no new information. It's dance theater, so it's theater with dance. And they're dancing, but like theatrical. It's theatrical dancing.
Dancing, yeah.
The Inquisition may be a group of geniuses, but in the end, they don't reflect fully conscious, informed, and considered points of view. There is likely an element of basic reptilian fear and revulsion at their core. Maybe that's why Karminski gives such a confusing explanation of the impossible to Daniil. Not because it's a secret, but because he truly has no rational explanation. This is as good a time as any to point out the theological implications of the word Inquisition. Karminski posits an immutable law that seems to defy common sense in a way that feels reminiscent of Christian apologetics. Besides this bizarre exchange where he stonewalls Daniil for pointing out the blatant contradiction in his beliefs, he also has this notion that he's going to make the impossible bend to the law. The Inquisitions throughout the Catholic world persecuted beliefs rather than actions, and it did so on behalf of a thing that is both so absolute and powerful it controls all, yet so delicate it needs to be protected at the minutest level, just as a matter of public safety. Like with the Christian Inquisitions, there is an implicit note of idolatry embedded in the attack. If you believed in only one god, it wouldn't be so frightening that other people believed in their gods. The only reason a heretic would concern you would be if a little part of you believes that those gods are real and not to be interacted with. To borrow a line from an extremely intelligent and handsome YouTuber, and as powerful as the witch hunters are, and as brutal as the subjugation of the witches can be, the witches always win, because they convince the witch hunter that they can rival God with their creativity. The witch hunter wouldn't waste time on the hunt unless the idea of magic had some power over them. Therefore, nature isn't a passive object that is infinitely flexible to whatever exists, as you or I might think about it. It is a subjective force that exercises dominion over everything it encompasses. A more modern understanding of nature is that it's basically a static plane populated by beings that can manipulate it in any way they see fit. Such a thing doesn't require protection, it simply is whatever it becomes. But Karminski posits that nature is an intelligent thing that enforces service to itself by prescribing the behaviors of everyone inside it. And this prescription is imperfect. It doesn't take every single potential action into account, because it leaves openings for clever or unlucky people to exploit. This to say, there is a quasi-religious shade to the Inquisition that provides context for Karminski's actions. He isn't charged with arbitrarily punishing that which is unpredictable or the potentially dangerous, like the initial Inquisitors might have done, if our headcanon is sound. His job is to enforce a kind of normality for other reasons, maybe due to some innate sense of piety, like the Christian Inquisitions might have claimed, or maybe it's just a good way to accumulate wealth and power by keeping the people on their toes, as the real-world Inquisitions actually did. I will argue shortly that Karminski is a more orthodox kind of Inquisitor. I believe that he adheres to the tenets of the organization with greater zeal than certain other Inquisitors I could mention. He is known as the hanging judge, and his reputation and methods are more in line with a general sense of mortal panic that runs through the populace when the Inquisition is in town. And yet, the word itself just means questioner, one who inquires. Karminski doesn't seem interested in inquiry. He makes an exceptionally brash entrance into the town, immediately rounding up its leaders and nearly killing them, all while vilifying and disempowering the only licensed doctor it has access to, which is likely to kill even more people. This brutality happens for reasons that are confusing at best and sinister at worst. This naturally prompts comparison to Aglaia Lilich, everyone's favorite mommy with a comb-over. Her hair keeps me up at night. I'm a millennial. I love a side part, but this is too far. Whatever she's hiding, it's not worth it. Aglaia Lilich is, of course, our main window into the Inquisition, and she does inquire. She questions with earnestness. Everyone from the powers that be to herself is a viable subject for analysis. Karminski, having an interest in miracles, is a danger to Aglaia, but Aglaia is just as equally a danger to Karminski. She is a strict adherent of the law who always seems to incite those around her to rebellion against it. She won't allow God to blaspheme any more than people. Her antagonism against Karminski, the Canes, and the very concept of miracles can tell us more about how the Inquisition fits into the cosmos of Pathologic's world. At the end of Daniel's original campaign, Aglaya and he get a chance to hash out exactly what the utopia on the Gorkin is. Aglaya alleges that it was created with the specific goal of distilling human beings with what is perhaps clumsily described as inner force. The fact that it was devised to do a thing, to change the way people think and behave, is what she finds concerning. Utopias in her mind aren't peculiar for what they are, but what they do. They are machines of social engineering. In Pathologic 3, Georgi states that Simon intended for the town to be a place where different people and convictions could live in peace, complementing and enriching one another. The goal of this machine is allegedly to consummate the principles Simon believed in. In reality, it was a vehicle for his personal immortality. Again, that's another video, but suffice to say for now, Simon used memory, the impressions he left on other people, to become immortal. This, to me, resembles impossible objects, and by all accounts, it seems like that is the reason Aglaya goes to the town, rather than simply having been assigned there as an average professional. So let's try to understand Aglaya's angle in all this. To start, how does Aglaya even know about the utopia? We don't actually have to speculate. We have a pretty clear picture of Aglaya's life and how it led her to the town, certainly more so than many other characters. She is related to the Cains, and her own sister is considered the matriarch of this town. The Cains and the Liliches probably knew each other for years in the capital before the Cains left, taking Nina with them. So Aglaya is well aware of the Cains' ideas and ambitions. In the original game, Aglaya posits that Daniel was driven out to this wondrous town in the steppe on purpose in order to protect the utopia, the impossible thing.
At the persistent pleasure of the capricious powers that be, the miracle that has been accidentally embodied as the polyhedron is forced to stay there, captured by the flesh of the town that has nurtured it, feeding it with resources, people, and hot blood. This flesh has become its womb and its prison. You are by all definitions a hero, a miracle maker almost. It was the powers that be that have tried to make you detain a miracle here.
If Aglaya believes that Daniel is here to protect the utopia at the behest of the powers that be, should we assume that the Inquisition is in alignment with Aglaya against the powers that be, believing that they are cruel in defending the utopia? Well, no. Aglaya is a strange and enigmatic figure within the Inquisition, and she's often posed in opposition to their schemes. Let's go through the facts as we currently understand them. She studied under Hermann Orff, an unconventional inquisitor who isn't horrifically brutal with his search of the facts. He's somewhat humane in his dealings with civilians, while the Inquisition is known for brutal demonstrations of power to solve problems. The defunct Pathologic website says that Orff always set all his cards on the table, and Pathologic 3 continues with this metaphor in a way that I find interesting, and that's why I'm going to go on a tangent about games, for which I do not apologize. The two games returned to repeatedly are poker and chess. The Cains love cards. They're masters of holding secrets and only giving away the information needed to get what they want. Moves are 20% tactical and 80% performative to orchestrate their opponent's responses. In contrast, chess is 100% tactical. There is no bluffing in chess. If you want to make your opponent do something, you have to manipulate your pieces to force them to do it. There's a really fun moment in Pathologic 3 that I've been desperate to talk about. Khan is mumbling to himself and he says, "And if he made his pawn into, say, a knight, he'd checkmate me at once. But he won't want to be a knight, he'll want to be a queen, and that's how he'll lose." Now, I'm a complete amateur at chess, but this struck me as a deeply strange way to play the game. It makes me wonder if Khan is not very ill-suited to the goals to which he has committed himself. Chess is a perfect information game. You can't persuade someone into making a particular move by deception like you can in poker. The only way to predict a move is to force your opponent to make that move. If I have your king in check, it doesn't matter what move you wish you could make. You have to get out of check. Aglaya is associated with chess for obvious reasons. She's overwhelmingly transparent, and she can devise plans that will work out in her favor despite being open with her information. Khan has a pretty weak strategy here. His theoretical opponent may be arrogant or foolish, but to say that he will choose a queen over a knight implies that he Either A is so axiomatically driven to have another queen that he will put that priority over winning the game, or B, that Khan has somehow quantified his opponent's intelligence, information processing ability, impulsivity, and literally every other factor that might contribute to him noticing that promoting his pawn to a knight would get him a checkmate in one move, and determined that he will not make the right move. His opponent has access to the information. He's looking at the same board as Khan. No matter how dumb Khan thinks he is, there is always a possibility that he will make the right choice. Khan is assuming that there is no way he will see the opportunity, or that he hasn't actively been pursuing this strategy all along, and this prejudice is so strong that he doesn't even consider a strategy wherein he doesn't hand a checkmate over to his opponent on a silver platter. Maybe he should stick to poker. Anyway, Orf's influence on Aglaia is obvious. She learns from him and possibly even adopts his gentler approach to problem solving. Orf and his disciples make up a contentious block of the Inquisition. They are seen as radical and dissonant from the main body of the group. As Aglaia matures in her role as an inquisitor, her elder sister Nina is falling in with a very different sort of crowd in the capital. Aglaia is measured, calculating, and fiercely practical. Nina is an audacious, captivating mystic who becomes obsessed with molding the world into her image, like a hunk of clay. As Aglaia becomes more and more convinced that the law must be obeyed, Nina is coming to the conclusion that no law should stand in the way of innovation. Nina marries a man named Victor, who has 2 elder brothers, one of whom is a man that seems to understand Nina's transcendental ambitions like no one else can. Simon and Nina run away with their plans for their own little sandbox in the steppe. Aglaia finds the 2 of them inhumane, and when Nina leaves to become the matriarch of a greenhouse utopia out east, Aglaia decides to keep an eye on their machinations. As Nina and Simon build out the town, reaching toward the stars, Aglaia is reaching toward new heights as well, but in a very different way. She slowly begins to dissect the inner workings of her government, and even the powerful body beyond that. And while Simon, Nina, and their cadre are becoming more and more convinced that no law of reality could not be bent, Aglaia is becoming more and more determined to defend the absolute sovereignty of reality. As she chips away at the walls that keep her world together, Aglaia finds her comrades being killed off. The Orf block of the Inquisitorial Corps is suddenly much smaller, and Aglaia herself finds a particular adversary in Mark Karminski, the hanging judge. As the name suggests, he's not exactly a humanitarian, as Aglaia describes herself. Knowing the more orthodox behaviors of the Inquisition involve blood and brutality, one imagines that Mark may have a bit more institutional backing than Aglaia, whose compatriots are being spirited away. Unlike Aglaia, Karminski has a lot in common with the Canes. He has a special interest in impossible objects, things that break the law of reality, as Simon and Nina are restless to do. But he doesn't want such impossibilities to propagate and flower unpredictably like the Canes do. His goal is to disarm them and bend them in service to the law. Let's pause here. Karminski provides more context into the Inquisition, particularly as a foil to Aglaia. We already knew that Aglaia was persecuted by the powers that be. In every iteration of the character, there is always a doubt as to whether Aglaia is in the town officially. In the original game, Victor speculates that she's here illegally, and it's only Aglaia's word that assures us that she is sanctioned to be here. In Pathologic 2, she's murdered by the army for reasons that Aglaia is aware of, but extremely secretive about. And in 3, she's just transparently here against orders. With Karminski in the mix, Aglaia can't afford to be as cryptic. It's because of Mark and his adversarial relationship to her that this newest iteration of Aglaia is so chatty. She's desperate, active, and aggressive. In her efforts to overtake Karminski, she introduces us to 2 new sides of the Inquisition. That it is their job to guide the turning points in history, and that they recruit. Not other inquisitors, but candidates for patronage. Informants, more or less. Aglaia begins courting Daniil for this role 6 months before he finds himself in the town on the Gorkin River. At this point, he's learned nothing about Simon. But Karminski postulates to Daniil that she pursued this relationship having calculated that Daniil would inevitably find himself pulled to Simon, since he's searching for immortality and Simon claims to be immortal. Aglaia preempts this meeting and tries to get her hooks into Daniil as soon as possible. She can't control the Canes, but if Daniil is willing to be her secret agent on the inside, she may be able to influence their next moves. She maintains a tense correspondence with Simon in the lead up to the eventual meeting, and the contents of their conversation prompts her to recognize a turning point, a great upheaval in the status quo that creates a fruitful environment for new possibilities. Bear these two facts in mind as we continue through Aglaia's life. Inquisitors recruit, and they are attracted by turning points. So, Aglaia gets herself to the town, with or without official authorization, and decides that she needs to get rid of her correspondence with Simon, and she does a pretty poor job of it. We can get our hands on it on day 4 of Pathologic 3, and the remains are just spotty enough to be very engaging to a player with no social life. Ag cannot burn anymore. You are, as always, pursuing some lay, but you are looking in the wrong place. An amazing paradox indeed. What you seek is not ahead of you. I'm to leave this woman alone. Focus on bringing it to life. You hardly need my advice on. I imagine this woman refers to Yulia Lyracheva, as she is the one the Canes have. I put my whole pussy into the name, and that's it. I imagine this woman refers to Yulia Lyracheva, as she is the one the Canes are suddenly about to persecute and send away from the town for creating the Atrium Street. Assuming this scrap of letter is from Aglaia, we should consider this bringing it to life comment in further detail. This wording is most commonly associated with the Changeling, who is in this game revealed to be something of a byproduct of Simon and Isidore's actions before their deaths. She is herself brought into the world to fix them from the inside out, and it is she who desires to bring the dolls to life. She observes that everyone she meets is a doll incapable of exerting real will. We've probably all guessed that Aglaia knows that she's a character. In the original, she understands herself to be a doll which runs in the family of the powers that be. And in Pathologic 2, she writes her courier's papers in code, implying that she's sending her instructions straight into the code of the game. So, Aglaia is somewhat clued into the greater reality outside her world. Her using the term bringing it to life is going to be important for later. But let's return to Yulia Lyracheva. Yulia is being ousted for creating a street that collapses fate into one horrible eventuality. Aglaia wants Simon not to focus on that, but to focus on something else. Maybe anything else. This opens up the idea that the plague came about when Simon walked down the Atrium Street, and that his nightmare might have been the plague itself. He was crying as he returned to the town, after all, the prick. This, in conjunction with the segment before, an amazing paradox that Simon is looking for in the wrong place, which is not ahead of you, would imply that Aglaia is talking him away from instigating the plague. Don't focus on the fate you've seen, but on the town you're hoping to mold into a utopia. Perhaps the reference to a thing which cannot burn anymore is the town itself, which was originally struck with the pest 5 years before. This being the case, we might assume that Simon opened communication with Aglaia for counsel, since it certainly seems like Aglaia is interested in providing it. She's a brilliant adversary of his. If he's having competing thoughts about bringing the plague into the town, maybe he would seek the perspective of a very different but no less brilliant mind. That would be pretty odd, though, and I wouldn't necessarily rest an argument on it. Aglaia isn't just a dissenting opinion, she is a fierce and powerful opponent of Simon's ideas. And she's an inquisitor. He's just some local town leader in the steppe. Why would Simon initiate a conversation with the person most likely to stop him? And, realistically, why would Aglaia care about Yulia being ousted from the town? Sure, they're acquaintances, but hardly close enough that Aglaia would rather do her a good turn when she could benefit from having a genius colleague with her in the capital. For Yulia's part, she doesn't seem to have any idea that her old friend has a relationship with the Canes at all. She's extremely intelligent, but she doesn't seem politically savvy. All this intrigue doesn't really interest her. It seems like she tends to focus on her work and keeps the externalities in the periphery of her mind. She isn't completely naive about Aglaia's methods and her standing within the Inquisition, though. In Pathologic 2, Artemi finds her outside the cathedral contemplating what, I believe, is Aglaia's chance at survival. She says, 80% or so. 85 if she's been to the capital in May. Could have been even higher, but that bird story. She seems optimistic about Aglaya's chances, but that bird story lowers her overall survivability. Yulia explains to Artemi that these birds refers to these special people. They had a particular way of spreading false information through a kind of reflection. She invented the process, Aglaya Lilich. No matter. But just after that, she was blacklisted by the powers that be. Several people got purged from the government, too. What the hell could this bird method be, if it caused her to be blacklisted by the big guys behind the curtain? Inquisitors are known for being pretty ruthless, so I have a hard time believing it was just beyond the pale of human behavior. Taking it at face value, we know a couple of things. It's a means of spreading misinformation that isn't completely wrong, but only has enough truth involved to get the listener to believe it. We might extrapolate from the name that there is a randomized variable that needs to be accounted for in this method. After all, you don't control where a bird drops its seeds. You can only vaguely predict where it might do so. I imagine this would take a particular level of skill to do correctly. One would have to determine how much to deviate from the truth in order to actually accomplish something without seeming unbelievable. You would have to know how likely each individual person who hears the misinformation is to be influenced by it. Aglaya wouldn't be able to rely on interrogating each potential listener in this case. Even though she's good at attuning herself to other people during an inquiry, she can't possibly know which people each of her plants will relay the misinformation to. She would have to rely on mathematics and probability to determine how the lie will affect larger bodies of people. She would therefore want to have a pretty detailed understanding of the person she was lying to, how the proverbial bird might choose to migrate. Aglaya would want a person whose opinions, thoughts, and actions could be predicted. Now, hear me out. Wouldn't it be kind of interesting if the person absentmindedly relaying this to Artemi was one of these birds? I think there's a lot of weirdness surrounding Yulia's story that could be explained pretty neatly if we understood her as an unwilling plant of Aglaya Lilich placed there to influence the Canes. Why would Aglaya ambiguously refer to Yulia as this woman in her letter to Simon unless she was trying to keep her acquaintance with her a secret? Wouldn't she just say, her? Our mutual buddy who we've been talking about, her? The use of the term this woman, at least in English, creates the impression that she is actively trying to obscure the fact that she knows her. How did Yulia even end up in this town? She was one of the Oneira techs, but having worked with the Inquisition, one might assume that the hubristic Canes would want to keep their distance. They did eventually consider her too rational, after all. Supposedly, they wanted me to, and I quote, rise above myself, which I was supposedly incapable of because I was too rational. I'll concede that they rise above themselves all the time. It's what happens when your head's up your ass. Solid burn, Yulia! By Cain standards, she's far too logical to fit into their plans to agitate the heavens. But, as far as mathematicians go, she isn't particularly reductionist either. Full disclosure, this video has drifted very far away from its initial concept. I started writing last year, when I was captivated by the similarities and differences between Yulia and Aglaya. The two women are mathematicians who work with probability in a way that feels very abstract, but gives them strikingly accurate prescience. But, I thought, the two are on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. A dream builder and a humanitarian. Yulia's after-death line in Pathologic 2 was particularly beautiful to me.
My path was called Tripwires of Fate. I built the roads of this town such that humans became red blood cells in its veins, and I laid bare the logic of immanence.
Immanence is a theological idea that God manifests in the corporeal world as movement and life. God is why my fingers move and my heart beats. God inspires me to do a brave thing, and hardens my heart when I have to make a big decision. I speak to God, and I have a personal relationship to it. I expect that God can speak back in some way. This is contrasted with the idea of transcendence, though the two aren't necessarily exclusive. A transcendent God rules over me, commands me, and I obey unquestioningly, because to ask a question would be useless. I cannot understand the thinking of God, for I do not know what it knows. This is paired in Pathologic 2 with the idea of correspondence in action, as young Vlad says, the idea that the material copies the divine. But unfortunately, this will have to be another video too. What matters for now is that Yulia isn't exactly the shrewd pragmatist that Aglaya is. She's oddly pious in her own way. Aglaya thinks that God is unjust. She will destroy anyone who disturbs the natural order, which does not include God and can most certainly be abused by God. Yulia considers God to be a thing that is naturally emergent in the body and can therefore be expressed in physical space, which is how she regards her network of roads in the town. Again, she's far from compatible with the Cains, but among the people most likely to have fallen into Aglaya's orbit, Yulia might just be the best candidate for this bird method. It's very strange that the Cains don't explain to Yulia exactly what she did to get on their shit list. Like, entirely expected, but super strange nonetheless, which I think is telling in kind of a funny way. Like, the idea that she's too rational is definitely Georgi's opinion, right? Victor is the one that's more concerned with the fact that she hurt 18 people. She's definitely incompatible with the Cain's way of thinking, which would be an odd thing to discover now if they'd been colleagues in the capital for years before bringing her out east. Is it not more likely that Aglaya orchestrated Yulia's addition to the Oniratex to keep an eye on things? Someone of Yulia's interests and patterns of thought might be more inclined to write to her fellow mathematician about the ridiculous projects of the Cains, rather than turning to the other Oniratex for friendship. We also know that Yulia has managed to sense a kind of upheaval coming to visit the town. In The Marble Nest, Daniil notes that Clara the Changeling insists that Yulia is beyond the threat of the plague, being the only person to understand the true logic of what's unfolding. Utter drivel. I'm not necessarily convinced that it is drivel, Daniil. If Aglaya calculated that you would be attracted to the town and devised a way to get you there in time to stop the plague, why wouldn't Yulia have the same inclination and ability? Aglaya tells Daniil that she sensed the turning point brewing in the town through her letters to Simon, but I wonder if Yulia didn't have a small part to play in this revelation as well. If we assume that Aglaya is responsible for sending her here, and Yulia herself seems oblivious to this, we might extrapolate that the Inquisition doesn't have its eye on the town on the Gorgon. If they did, if Karminski did, the town might have been overrun by bloodthirsty geniuses years before. By keeping what she knows close to the chest, she prevents the Inquisition from exploiting it. Knowing this, we may be able to guess why this put her in danger with the powers that be. A person like Yulia being distributed to the town of Simon Cain for the purpose of altering his projects might keep Simon from achieving his goals, making a utopia, creating immortality, and achieving this vague sense of transcendence that he promised his followers. Does this mean that the more traditional, hardline inquisitors who may have more institutional support would try to protect these works, or even take them over? This feels pretty likely to me. It's obvious enough that Aglaya is very willing to go against her superiors to stop these inhumane utopias. It wouldn't surprise me if this fundamental drive to destroy detained miracles is why she is an inquisitor in the first place. As the sister of Nina Cana, maybe Herman Orff sought her out because he knew that she had a direct connection to the Cains. Or maybe it was Aglaya who approached Orff and his compatriots, who she believed would be more sympathetic to her cause. Either way, it really cannot be the case that Aglaya stole away to the town in order to save herself. It is almost certainly the case that she does so despite knowing that it is the final nail in her coffin. In Pathologic 2, she immediately seeks out a strategy that she knows will kill her and resigns herself to death, only running away from the army because a cute guy insists that it would be cool if she fought back against her fate. I don't have an Artemi body pillow, stop saying shit, Ander! In Pathologic 3, she tries to get the army to destroy the polyhedron, while an inquisitor with more power and legal standing is trying like mad to stop or kill her. She tells Daniil that she is okay with dying if she manages to save the town. Aglaya is going to do whatever it takes to bring the polyhedron down, period. Going into her face-to-face confrontation with Karminski, it becomes very clear that the problem he's been sent to solve isn't the plague destroying the town, but the threats to the polyhedron. He needs to solve the problem of Aglaya Lilich. Think about the timeline of the games. The 3 iterations of the story so far involve the plague being discovered on day 2 or 3, and the Inquisition arriving on day 7. We have electricity in this town, and we know about radio waves, but we certainly have no evidence of a telegraph, certainly not in the town hall, which is the most likely place that you would find it. The idea that the central government learned of the plague and appointed an inquisitor in time to get them there within 4 or 5 days doesn't seem practical for the time period. We may assume that Daniel was lured out to the steppe to preserve the polyhedron, or maybe that he wound up there despite efforts to stop him from going. But either way, it's Aglaia that is the dangerous entity here. She is the potential cause of the destruction of the polyhedron, and the powers that be would have far more cause to remain abreast of that whole situation rather than a random outbreak of a disease. In other words, Aglaia Lilich doesn't go to the town to solve the unsolvable problem of the plague. She is the unsolvable problem that the army and Karminski are dispatched to deal with, whether they know it or not. That's why the official inquisitor dispatched to the town happens to be zealously in favor of appropriating impossible objects, and this particular army is led by a general expendable enough to be thrown into Inquisitor's line of fire, so to speak. I cannot stress this enough. In any other story, Aglaia would be the hero. With all this in place, she finally has her face-to-face with Karminski. Karminski tells General Block that it's his order and imperative to save the polyhedron, due to its
uniqueness and, therefore, its strategic value.
And this allows him to place the polyhedron under state protection. Aglaia obviously takes the opposing view. She believes that impossible objects are not only wrong, but ugly, unsalvageably wrong. The town of miracles and wonders is a utopia, a thing which detains miracles against the will of nature. Such perversions of nature have been shown to Aglaia to cause suffering to real people. Miracles are grasped at with sacrifice, and Aglaia is a humanitarian. Karminski has no such concerns. He causes suffering all the time, and more importantly, leveraging miracles for strategic value is more important than saving life. Andre says that he appropriates impossible masterpieces. The thing we see him express particular interest for in Pathologic 3 is the Atrium Street, a devastating piece of city planning meant to create an experience where all eventualities were visible at once, allowing the pedestrian to select their future. Through secondhand observation, and finally through testing the thing, he sees it as a dangerous impossibility that requires disarming. But that doesn't mean destruction. He can't abide the idea of destroying such a thing. And if we get any clear insight into his heart, untethered from intrigue, it is that he is overwhelmingly fixated on the impossible. Karminski says something I find odd when defending his experimentation with the Atrium Street.
I remember a time when people were open and expansive. Who narrowed you? The impossible stands before your very eyes, and instead of rushing to meet it, to comprehend it, to partake of it, you turn away.
When was that time, Mr. Karminski? It must have been long ago, back when free artistry was celebrated and not feared. It seems to me that the Inquisition sprang up in a political climate where the impossible was systemically squeezed out of the population wherever it appeared, and if the student riots referenced in the latest game are in any way a reaction to that suppression, it must go back about a decade, since that's around the time Daniel and Andre would have been studying together. The Inquisition initially flourished in a time dominated by fear of the impossible, unpredictable, and untamable. But, in Karminski's mind, his work with the Inquisition ought to involve preservation. He is driven by what seems to be a pretty earnest obsession with the impossible, but I think it's interesting that this drive doesn't relegate him to the same danger Aglaia faces from the Inquisition. Why allow him to indulge this special interest in the impossible? The Inquisition would of course want to advance its power over the impossible and over people, and the aid of impossible objects is a resource that the Empire seems uniquely in abundance of, so why not take control over the supply? But the idea of cultivating the impossible, of arming it, seems antithetical to the impossible itself. These devices go wrong almost as a matter of course. They are audacious and wild by nature. Even if they do what was intended, the intent is often insane. Like, if Julius Street worked correctly, would this world really be improved by a random assortment of people making their wildest dreams come true with no accountability to the people that they would affect? I don't know, in a town with racial tension, deep-seated ideological rifts, and free-range children, Maybe one random pedestrian shouldn't be able to bend the entire world to meet their desires, and they certainly shouldn't be able to do so by accident. Perhaps Karminski himself is simply mesmerized by these things, and is only using the power of the Inquisition to add to his own personal collection. But if he is sanctioned to do this, to disarm and manipulate these objects in service to the law, there must be someone up the chain of command who thinks that they are worth the potential risk. Maybe the main goal is to send in the Inquisitor most likely to have a personal stake in going up against Aglaia, but even that is telling about the priorities of the powers that be and the purpose of the Inquisition. All this to say, Aglaia isn't just reacting to one town or one Inquisitor with an interest in the impossible. There is an institutional interest in the impossible that we don't yet know the extent of. One supposes that the miracles of the small steppe towns referred to in the Miracle Seeker ending emerged from a backlash to the suppression of new ideas. People like the Canes ran off into the steppe to seed their miracles without the watchful eye of the Inquisition. In the original game, Aglaia notes that the utopias crafted throughout the Empire were dying out, with the town on the Gorkin having miraculously hung on by its fingernails despite the advancing grip of the Central Powers, the railroad, the meat exporting business, everything that pulls them further into the broader world. Now, this particular town stands on the verge of crossing over into a full miracle, the kind seen in Pathologic 2's nocturnal ending, and in Daniel's endings where he doesn't allow for the polyhedron to be demolished. The earth comes to life, a plague kills the unworthy and deifies the worthy, and two men achieve immortality, locking eyes over a sea of depersonalized human flesh to detain infinity. Simultaneously, it stands on the verge of awakening from the dream and becoming a mundane place where people are no more and no less than people, with their own thoughts and fears and desires. Here, we have two Inquisitors with different opinions. The one whose life is at stake wants to wake the town up, and the one with institutional backing wants to put it into a coma, and use it as a blood bag. How does this square with the whole idea of suppressing the impossible, the Inquisition's initial goal? Why isn't the Doctrinaire Inquisitor trying to stop the impossible structure, and the Rebel fighting to defend it? I think the answer lies in this idea of turning points. This is what Aglaia and Karminski are fighting over in Pathologic 3. Not strictly what happens here, but how these actions will change the status quo, as they inevitably will. Aglaia goes so far as to say that every stone in the town will be different after the turning point. As she tells Daniel, it's these turning points that the Inquisition is actually attracted by, not just unsolvable problems, but pivotal situations that could have one of two polar outcomes of extreme significance. They want to guide these turning points, set the curve on the proper axis. During times wherein the curve of history takes a sharp bend, the Inquisition steps in to keep the curve's further direction on the coordinate axes under control. What proper entails should be investigated. And this is where I tell you that I've buried the lead. A bit. There is another side to the Inquisition's ontological status that adds some much desired detail about their goals. Not only has the Inquisition infiltrated every aspect of life in the game world, there is textual evidence that they invaded this world from a reality more similar to our own. The Feverish Feeling ARG provides a wealth of insight into the Inquisition. The most striking piece being that Pathologic 2 is a project undertaken by the Inquisition to act as a death vaccine. This word vaccine comes up a lot in this early promotional material, and Feverish Feeling presents it as a concrete goal for the Inquisition, and the word's meaning is fully developed through its use in the ARG. It's one of those special meanings that requires the construction of an entire fictional world to understand. And so, for all you pathologic laymen with a life, here is the story of Feverish Feeling. The year is 1998, and a courier named Eugene has been assigned to a very odd delivery. First of all, the names are very unusual. The package is being sent from Miraculous to INQ. Second, he has to provide his own packaging, as the parcel is just a hodgepodge of sundry items, including 3 shoes, a pound of rice, feathers, a vial of a silvery liquid with a note indicating that the substance isn't mercury, a metallic brooch with a heart insignia on it, and a cooler. Eugene doesn't know it, but inside the cooler is a human heart. After about 5 minutes of Googling, I personally decided that the vial is probably filled with gallium. Gallium is used in imaging, often for tracking the replication of cancer cells through the body. Perhaps it is intended to be used for tracking the progression of something throughout the heart. Like, I don't know, a rare pathogen with vaguely mystical properties, for instance. To add to the weirdness, he has to bring the package to a museum a few minutes before midnight, but it's obviously closed. He doesn't know what to do, so he wanders back and forth between the street and the yard connected to the museum, and the stipulated time for the delivery passes. That's when she arrives. An unsettling woman, clearly riddled by disease and deformities, but Eugene is overcome by the impression that she's incredibly beautiful. But she also kinda looks like an addict, and he worries that he's being made complicit in drug trafficking. He asks for her ID, hoping he can just refuse to give her the package. And then he begins to feel strange. The houses seem to begin breathing, and now he can't stop thinking about his own breath. The human body is a bog, he thinks. Every time he breathes, he is made extremely aware of all the death occurring inside his own body. Millions of living beings dying and reproducing inside him. The woman tells him the package he's holding contains happiness. A more accurate description would be a pathogen called PGC-25. The human heart needed to be procured at just the right time for the pathogen to be preserved inside the organic material. Now it's simply too late. A human heart is only viable in a cooler for a few hours. So, she had no choice but to make him the carrier. He comes back the next day, hoping the maddening fixation on his own breathing might go away if he meets the woman again. But instead, he sees a little girl named Veronica. Veronica is an odd kid. She has a mature affect and seems to know more than a child should. She tells him that her father is inside the museum, but Eugene already knows that, somehow. He seems to know a lot of things he shouldn't be able to know. Eugene knows that Veronica's father is inside with a group of men, while she was intentionally left out here to wait. He knows that the woman from last night is Veronica's enemy. He extrapolates from this that Veronica's father and the men he associates with were trying to intercept the woman, stop her from passing on the disease, or making him breathe, as he says. Put a pin in it. Years later, Veronica will speculate that the day she met Eugene was when she herself became infected. 16 years after this meeting, Veronica creates a website and a secret mailing list to whom she sends cryptic emails. And that's where the audience comes in. She reflects upon her impending death from the happiness she was infected with back in 1998, and she vaguely threatens to unearth the secrets of her father's organization. She sends clues to the readers, including a few videos outside the Department of Public Health Infectious Unit, discussing an unusual outbreak, the origins of which remain a mystery. In another corner of the internet, a Facebook group called the Hopscotch Enthusiasts is investigating the organization Veronica's dad belongs to. They call themselves whistleblowers, but aren't particularly effective. They do manage a few impressive discoveries, but this is mostly by chance. One of them uncovers a memo by Senior Inquisitor Orvin to all members of the INQ, stating that cutlery from the cafeteria is being stolen. Orvin is bewildered that anyone would even think to steal these things because the organization's insignia is on them, which they are strictly prohibited from showing publicly. Luckily, the memo itself already has the insignia on it, so we get to check it out in more detail. Another memo strikes the group as more serious. Senior Inquisitor Orvin warns of an outbreak of PGC-25 within the organization. But when they get a little too close to the truth, the members begin dying. A suspicious suicide here, a car accident there, and several unspecified disappearances later, only one remains. Alex. and he's pissed off that Veronica is leading her readers into an investigation that got several of his friends murdered. He also seems to think that Veronica's motives might not be as pure as she's letting on. As Veronica gets closer to death, she tells her readers that all she wanted was for her brilliant father to find her and save her. If he didn't respond to her more mundane calls for help, maybe he would finally show himself if she threatened to air his dirty laundry. But he never came. And she knows she's at the end. The emails stop. But for Pathologic fans back in 2014, this wasn't the end. They used her clues to break into a secret page on her website, which is no longer available, where a message from Veronica's father greeted them. Veronica, I won't ask forgiveness. For what I've done, forgiveness is not asked. The virus of death is in every human, but it sleeps almost all our life long. But it has woken up in you because you are special. You know it's true. Everything will end soon. I have the panacea. I don't know who and what you are. I do, though. You are my happiness, and I will always love you. The letter concludes with an initial instead of a signature. The initial is followed by a step sigil, Sam, which represents the circle of life in its many forms. By the blood of the living creatures does the earth feed, but then it gives birth to herbs and feeds the living back. There was one more message, and while I can't find more than one reference to it, I do believe that it's authentic because it's the only message that links the ARG directly to the Pathologic 2 Kickstarter, which is what this whole thing was leading up to. Good afternoon. I hereby inform you that the current INQ project is moving to a new stage of implementation. I assure you that the term death vaccine, invented by unscrupulous gossips, has no connection with reality. However, in a sense, it really is a vaccine, a kind of inoculation against difficult life situations in which each of us could hypothetically find ourselves. By experiencing these situations in a safe toy form, you will develop resistance. You will have protection. At least, that is our theory. Of course, this letter does not obligate you to do anything, but I believe it may be useful to you. You won't be able to save everyone, but you can try. Veronica Vera, INQ. P.S. Thank you. The word vaccine hyperlinks to the Pathologic 2 Kickstarter page. Pathologic 2 is the safe toy form of life's difficulties, designed to inoculate us from death? Seems a bit on the nose, but we'll return to it. The final letter, in conjunction with Veronica's last letter, elaborates on the use of death and the motif of vaccination. Veronica describes her descent into death in her last email. The beast of the bog has knocked on my door today, she writes. Remember that this is the second use of the word bog in this ARG. The other time it was used as a metaphor, as Eugene described the feeling of becoming infected as immediately realizing that his whole body was just an ecosystem of microorganisms living and dying. In my last video on Pathologic 2, we discussed the way the disease unpersons people. The sand pest reminds people that life isn't a thing bestowed upon individual humans, but is rather a homogeneous mass of stuff. It can create complexity, but is fundamentally simple. Man is a bog, an environment for single cells that coordinate and flow into each other, but is not an essentially bounded, singular thing. As I mentioned, this regression from the modern sense of an individual into unpersonhood, reunion with the earth through the sand pest, makes many people feel a kind of happiness toward the end. We don't think of a bog as a bounded thing with its own soul. It's more of a sprawling, indefinite, and fluctuating system of simple life forms. A bog is therefore far less delicate than a human. It may not be immortal, but its life and health can't be measured in the same way, and isn't contained by the same limits. Veronica goes on to write the following. Some of you have asked about my childhood and old friends, but I could hardly remember anything. This led one Reddit user to speculate that Veronica Vera, the Inquisitor, intentionally became infected, causing her to forget much of her past. Memory is a recurring thread for her. Fans uncovered some paratextual photos with scrawled-in messages pointing to Veronica's failing memory. She does remember her father and the shadowy group that he was attached to, and the day she may or may not have been infected with the pathogen. Even her first impression of the boy, Eugene. but everything else seems to be draining away with her life force. Players of Pathologic 3 may be curious about the word memory, because the game posits that memories are what creates immortality. Most people agree that a person is a kind of bounded entity, but we disagree on what exactly binds us to ourselves, what makes us experience a synchronicity. If there is no objective nature of reality in which a soul or something like that can do the trick easily, there must be a way subjectivity can create persons, and subjects are things that perceive. So perception becomes integral to this subjective explanation of personhood. What makes me me is that you and people I know and people who pass me on the street can see me, behold me. Daniil is referred to as Simon's beholder. This is what Hegel's Lordship and Bondage essay is about, if you would like further reading on the idea. Self-consciousness emerges through the process of seeing oneself reflected in the other, replacing that impression with an understanding that the other is in fact not the original self-consciousness, and therefore learning what the self-consciousness is by the negation. You look like me, which means I must look like you. So we're in the same category of thing. But I like Thin Mints, and you would rather die than ruin chocolate with mint. So you must be your own distinct thing. But this has to be mutual. The other must also be able to see itself reflected in you, realize you are not it, and recognize itself distinctly. If that other thing couldn't recognize you, you couldn't recognize it as a conscious mind that has its own internal sense of existence. If it can't look back at you and determine what you are, it's not a subject, a thing with a subjective experience. It's an object. Since memory is essentially perception untethered from time, Simon is able to use the town and the polyhedron to capture timeless perception of himself. Inviting a guy to dinner after he tries to stab you in the gut creates a striking memory, doesn't it? As Veronica loses every memory of her life before, as the beast of the bog invades her home, the boundaries holding her together fall away too. If memories are a steadfast manacle to life, death would naturally strip one of memory. After awakening, Veronica Vera is an entirely different entity. She doesn't whine on the internet for her Inquisitor father to save her, she is an Inquisitor. The implication then becomes that Veronica's death was more like waking up in a different identity, perhaps even a different world. A world where the INQ isn't killing members of a Facebook group or infecting unwilling guinea pigs with a lethal disease. In this world, they're simply making a game, a simulation, that immunizes people against horrors for the purpose of reducing all those nasty symptoms of death. Not the death itself, but the fear, the paralysis, the dread, the overwhelming sense of negation, of oblivion. The antigen of that vaccine is the sandpest. It's terrifying and vital in the world of the Veronica dying of the sandpest, but outside that world, Veronica Vera is made a bit stronger for it. And that is the death vaccine. Vera plays Veronica the way we play Artemi, Daniil, or Clara. They don't get to be immortal, not really, but their experiences give us a chance to give it a try. This is the revelation that really confused me. I had this idea that there were these distinct ideological alliances within the game. I believed that, complex as they may be, Pathologic generally, kinda sorta, has clustered two sets of opposing ideologies into a binary. On the one side, we have the Transcendentalists, the Utopians, the Kin, Isidore, Nina, and of course, the Canes, the ones that believe in constant tension and movement. A human being is a process, given subjectivity through observation. They are subjectivists first and foremost. There is no specific virtue embedded in a human, and there are certainly no objects in the nominal world if there is no perception of them. Therefore, a person should do that which prompts change, that which creates memories in the eyes of their beholders, and that which challenges the form of what a person can be. Nara isn't afraid of death, but of not fulfilling her purpose in Artemi's story, which is to be looked at, observed, and understood, so that he can learn the lines. On the other side, we have the more essentialist cohort. They're humanitarians above all. They don't necessarily believe that all people and things have some inherent spark of inherent existence, like a soul, but they believe that acting as though that is the case is the right way to live. Artemi's whole story is about being this kind of essential person who learns the value of limits and mortality. Aglaia obviously fits the bill too. She's brilliant and rebellious, having all of the traits she needs to challenge the law of nature, but she won't, because of the effect these actions have on people, who deserve not to suffer experimentation by their betters. Capella and Notkin are also in this camp, as fierce intellectual rivals of Khan. The idea is that the subjectivists are inherently very cruel to people, because they can't accept that most people have an innate drive to preserve a unified sense of self, and constantly feel the need to violate that sense of self. This is obviously not a hard and fast dichotomy, not by a long shot. These characters often have a lot more complexity around this theme. Bad Grief believes that there should be no rules, boundaries, or even social norms, which should group him in with the Transcendentalist crowd. But his reaction to learning about his status as a character in a game is to accept it as an objective fact about his world. He doesn't have a hint of subjectivity that would compel him to rebel against the natural order. He is a doll. Therefore, he isn't a person. On the other hand, we have the cathedral caretaker, someone for whom rules and limits make existence beautiful. And yet, he clearly considers himself a disciple of Farhad and the Oneira texts. When you discuss shooting down the polyhedron, the most unruly structure ever made, a thing which cuts through rules and demolishes the boundaries of death, he primly calls you a barbarian. But these unorthodox approaches to the two camps aren't random. They tell you something about the characters. Bad Grief, I have argued, is a flawed adult who exists in contrast to Notkin, a child who is able to think through Grief's ideas with more profundity than he can. The caretaker of the cathedral is a representative of Farhad's ideas, which are far more influenced by the steppe and the kin than the Stomatin brothers. Farhad was inspired by the endless horizon of the steppe, rather than the heavens. The caretaker's odd values might make us second-guess Farhad, lending to his enigmatic legacy. And then there's the Inquisition. If you take Eugene's intuitive understanding of the organization at face value, the Inquisition is against miracles. Of the shadowy people Veronica's father associates with, Eugene says they were enemies of her who makes us breathe. Her being the woman who infected him with a pathogen, PGC-25, the happiness delivered by Miraculous. Eugene was only infected because the recipient, INQ, didn't receive the package in time. It seems like the INQ was somehow trying to mitigate the harm Miraculous was trying to cause. To a silly little guy like me, that felt like a clear indication that the Inquisition was on the more objectivist side of the scale. And Aglaia, having been the only on-screen Inquisitor this series saw for over 20 years, this felt like a solid assumption to me. Aglaia is the voice of the law. She sees the universe as a machine. She maintains that the logic of the universe is above everything. Polyhedra be damned. To her, contending with God, too, is a form of restoring justice and natural law. And in Pathologic 3, the destruction of the polyhedron is, arguably, described as a god's suicide. The polyhedron is likened to a god. So, the Inquisition is against detaining and mechanizing miracles. This feels consistent with the principles of its founding. Playing around with the rules of nature leads to unspeakable horrors. Don't open that box. And kill or torture anyone who tries. But I'm sure attentive viewers can already poke a few holes in this interpretation. Veronica was infected by the disease intentionally by the Inquisition. They're obviously interested in exploring the pathogen, and while they may have been enemies with her who makes us breathe, it seems like a stretch to say that they were trying to stop Eugene from being infected. In the end, they wanted that cooler with the heart and the vials of gallium. Maybe their methods were a bit more gentle, but they were interested in studying the disease that is something like a universal panacea to those who can survive it. And then there's this idea of the death vaccine, which is recurring throughout the franchise.
Think of it as a vaccine for your mind. By putting you in a terrible situation, we're forcing you to make a decision more quickly.
But doesn't it help you to get a better understanding of yourself?
The best way to create a believable simulation capable of creating the sense of a contaminated environment is building a game.
This technology of the soul, where one embeds death into themselves to develop a resistance to suffering, is similar to, but definitely not in alignment with the fiction of Pathologic and 99% of Feverish Feeling. Building up a resistance to suffering in a game so that you can deal with hardship and even death isn't what the Sandpest offers, which is immortality, transcendence, power. But we already know why. Veronica lives in a world where the Sandpest exists, but Vera lives in a world with Pathologic, which is a video game and can only do so much. The fictionality of the town and the story and the characters has always been such a significant part of Pathologic's text. Something that always gets me about it is just how depressingly small it makes the world feel at first glance. Aglaya's fatalistic outlook in Pathologic 2 almost feels in contradiction to what she actually accomplishes. She manages to contend with God. Getting the polyhedron shot down is a massive act of resistance against those who would use it by hurting and to hurt lots and lots of other people. And yet, she knows that the polyhedron is a toy, Simon is a doll, and that Artemi and Daniil are only avatars for a shadowy presence that inhabits them like a ghoul. Aglaya's story is about taking the illusion seriously, and all the weird shame and embarrassment and hopelessness that comes with it. She must die in the town. She must bring down the polyhedron, even though the final decision will not be made by her, and she won't live to see the trial of the gods. But she still cares for the people she has to protect. In Artemi's story, he helps her along this path by strengthening her resolve to rebel. In Daniil's, she fully submerges herself in the role, planning well ahead of time and achieving an almost overwhelming victory over her opponent, who needs to use banal time travel if he wants a chance to best her. If the world of Pathologic is a baseball diamond, the Inquisition is the umpire, stepping in to mediate how the game is played. They have their counterparts in and out of the world that they use to experience it and its particular horrors. When Aglaya Lilich dies in Pathologic 2, there may well be an Aglaya Vera, who wakes up with a revelation about fate and gods and miracles. The Inquisition is obviously conflated with the Icepick Lodge developers in this layer of fiction. I often find this meta stuff pretty boring because it can limit the exploration of the text down to, and it was all a game by children. Don't think about it too hard, you fucking freak. Katara liked Aang the whole time. And yeah, Pathologic is infamous for this element. It feels like an aggressive narrative choice, and it's supposed to be. You aren't supposed to live in the game. The game is a tool created for a purpose. But, and this may just be me resisting the idea that Pathologic characters know that they are in a game series called Pathologic, because that still feels very limiting and unfair, but I can't help but think that Veronica Vera exists in a fiction of her own. I mean, obviously she isn't real, but I also don't think that she's a one-for-one stand-in for Icepick Lodge. She's not just a cheeky way to get us to back the game on Kickstarter. She exists in a world where an organized group of geniuses are actively trying to craft the experience of being human. Artists alone can't do that. And Icepick Lodge is fond of the belief that its games create completely unique experiences in its players, and even though their characters are fond of chastising the player for eluding the point of their games, their speeches do little to clarify an exact intent, allowing players to run away with their own feelings and lessons and interpretations. By contrast, Inquisitor Vera wants to create a simulation that will cause subjects to develop a resistance to difficult stimuli, learn to deal with them, and still do their best to achieve their goals despite adversity. The Inquisition has more of a mission than a vision. When they created the simulation of Veronica, the hopscotch enthusiast, and She Who Makes Us Breathe, they cast themselves in the role of the shadowy, sinister presence that instigates the plague. They go into the step where it comes from, as shown in the fact that they return with knowledge of a sigil that evokes the kin's understanding of life in its many iterations. Singular and within the body in one moment, then flowing from body to body in another, then dissipating into everything in the next. They begin to kill off the people researching them. They try to study the pathogen, doing so in the most shady way possible, and even getting themselves infected in the process, which makes it almost inevitable that the random courier assigned to transport it would get infected. They contrive the infection of a little girl who seems special enough to not simply die, but to use death to transition into a higher state of consciousness. They do it all to contrive one particular moment of study. The moment Veronica dies is instructive. She calls attention to how documenting it may be useful to everyone else, since they will die too. She refers to the opening of a door, while her illness was previously referred to as a key. This single moment required the setup of a 16-year-long plan to accomplish. It may be just as accurate to say that Vera woke up after Veronica died as it is to say that Veronica transcended to a higher level of consciousness by dying of PGC-25. And with this frame of reference, the term turning point takes on a new meaning. The sort of pre-nascent, subconscious drive Inquisitors have for such turning points makes much more sense in a world dominated by crafted moments of experience, not random occurrences from a much larger and complex world, where people and the land and the cosmos are less easily calculated. In this world, people like Aglaya Lilich and Yulia Lyuracheva actually stand a chance at being able to deduce every action and extrapolate its greater meaning in the narrative. Because there is a narrative. Yulia understands fate from the perspective of a person who knows that events truly always have an intended meaning, but she attributes this meaning to a divine entity, referring to her work carving up the town as the logic of imminence. Also, she apparently has a Pathologic 2 voice line directed to the Bachelor, and it's this?
Don't repeat the Oniro-text's mistakes, friend. Do not wake.
What the hell? Why did that show up in Pathologic 3? It's so useful to me, personally. Why didn't they think about me and this thing that I'm writing right now? Why didn't they do that? Why? The Inquisitors, on the other hand, may understand fate as the intended constants in an experiment. For Aglaya, the knowledge that she will die comes from an understanding that her death is a necessity for the program to work. It's for this reason that the innate, miserable sense of wrongness emerges in the Inquisitors with respect to what is possible. The rules of their world were crafted for a purpose that they are directly subordinate to. The impossible must be possible by just the barest gaps that appear in the simulacrum of reality, trying to fit itself inside the fictitious. To preserve the integrity of the simulation, to advance their project, they police the edges where the unexplainable slips through. This makes Mark Karminski's actions and the ideas underpinning them even stranger. In what way exactly does Karminski uphold the project of the death vaccine? He tries to kill Daniil when he first arrives in the town. At least, it seems like he really wants to before Daniil says that Aglaya is his benefactor. Of course, Karminski would love to get rid of Aglaya herself if he could. But to get rid of Daniil is almost antithetical to the goal of subordinating the impossible to the will of the powers that be. Daniil is cultivating the impossible. To kill him is to crop short his driving purpose in the story. If the point of this world is to create a level of emotional resistance to the fear of death, it would be logical to extrapolate that enemies of death are enemies of the goal of the simulation. Death is a vital ingredient in a death vaccine. Killing Daniil siphons all his potential to that cause out of the story, sapping it of the apotheotic nature of the polyhedron and the sandpest. Or does it? What is this appropriation of the impossible? What purpose does the impossible serve in the simulation that Daniil threatens? If this whole level of existence was fabricated to create a moment where the acceptance of death was made to reckon with a challenge against death, Karminski is the one ensuring that the challenge against death is represented in the final conversation. Interestingly, Karminski is the underdog in this specific situation. He may have more institutional power than anyone else in the room, even the general, but Aglaya's clever thinking has put him in a situation where he needs Daniil's perfect performance just to have a chance at having his orders obeyed. The challenge toward death, exemplified by the Transcendentalists and patronized by Mark Karminski, must have a role in this whole exercise, one that Daniil threatens. Remember what I said about Veronica? About how her death causing Veronica Vera to awaken could equally be described as her ascending to Vera's level of consciousness through death, I think this is how Karminski conceptualizes his role. He doesn't experience that kind of existential horror Aglaya goes through at being a doll in the hands of cruel powers that be. Instead, he's an entirely valid agent in his own level of reality that he understands to be generated by, but not subordinate to, another. Aglaya is the objectivist, who thinks that a doll is helpless and needs to be protected. But Karminski is a subjectivist, who considers it his role to elevate himself and other dolls to another level of consciousness. But not through death, through the limitations of life dissipating without consciousness dissipating. Karminski is here to contend that the death vaccine does not, in fact, require death at all. Daniel, or rather the person playing him, necessarily threatens that. We come into this world with our own biases, and neglect the fact that there is something we miss by not putting our own bodies at stake. There has been much mockery over this idea that video game characters are worthy of moral consideration, and I'm not saying that they necessarily are, but it's not lost on me that many people on my side of existence who enjoy Pathologic games often side with the more objectivist side of the cast. We hate the Kanes and Isidore and Karminski because they are very cruel. Valid. But in the real world, I think most of us would consider a subjective view of reality more convincing. I myself don't believe in a god or hierarchies or biological gender, all those things associated with people who believe in souls and rigid spiritualistic castes of people. I don't believe in Platonic forms of what a human is, or what normal is, or what I am. But there I go into their world with a language and history that is not my own, and castigate them for not living up to my personal standards of behavior, as if there was only one way to be moral, or to be human. I'm not saying that the Kanes aren't despicable and also very, very annoying, but it's interesting the way we come into games and apply our own ideas over those of the characters. We look for ways to fix them into our ideologies, or try to suss out their identities in a way that is intelligible to us. When you play as Daniel, especially with the context of knowing how he traditionally chooses to conclude his story, I think you go in with the perhaps unconscious assumption that you are going to fix his mistakes. If the achievements of Pathologic 3 are any indication, we go in unwilling to be persuaded that the polyhedron is more worthy of survival than the town. Again, valid. But to someone like Karminski, the impossible is a unique and exceptional resource that his world has access to. Their means of transcendence and beauty and power. And here we come with an army and a cannon and a nearly totalitarian control over their fate. You could say that Karminski contends with God in his own way. He contends with you. Karminski lives in a world where there is a slight possibility that immortality and life are not mutually exclusive. Transcendence is attainable in that world. Consciousness without limitations can be calculated and enacted. And there is an unspoken drive amongst a selection of these characters to see this synthesis realized. And in no other character is this drive better exemplified than in Simon Kane. Simon managed a level of immunity to death without dying. For someone like Karminski, maybe Simon Kane is the end goal of this intricate program. If we indulge my little headcanon about Simon walking down the Atrium Street and seeing the plague, or even if we just consider that people like Yulia Lyaracheva can divine the meaning and currents of existence by understanding how the program works from the inside, what might we extrapolate about Simon's purpose in all this? Aglaya Lilich encourages Simon to forget the Kane's persecution of Yulia Lyaracheva and focus on bringing it to life. The Inquisition has a stake in the idea that this program resembles life, but at least in theory, this is against their prime directive. The simulation needs to be safe, toy-like. Is Simon a challenge to the simulation? Is he an opportunist capitalizing on it? Does he even really understand it? And this, dear viewer, is where I leave you. See you soon. I gotta extend a huge thank you to Polar Bear, who voiced Karminski in this video. Karminski is an odd figure, and I think he did a really good job of nailing down the sinister yet also bureaucratic vibe of his voice that I really liked. He also plays Pathologic here on YouTube. He's going through Pathologic 3 right now. He also does just like a lot of fun, quirky games that I find very interesting. I've watched a couple of his playthroughs now. If you need a new playthrough person to watch, especially a person who's going through Pathologic 3, definitely check him out. I'm gonna link him down below. I know that Pathologic 3 and Laid Back and Comedic don't intuitively go together, but he does a good job. So, especially if you need to start associating Pathologic 3 with things that lower your blood pressure, might be a good place to go. Couldn't be me. I shrink up in a corner and cry myself to sleep every time I see Pathologic 3. Anytime I open Steam to play Sky, Children of Light, I just start crying tears of blood. Also, I need to thank the members of this channel. Right, little old me, with supporters, only one of whom is related to me. Incredible. So, without further ado, thank you very, very much to Shain Slepian, Ratgirl Games, and Sir, who will not be appearing in this video. Thank you very, very much. You don't have to support me financially, but it does help, so thank you. Quick question to anybody, if you're still watching this far. Would you theoretically be interested in seeing an animated thing that I make? I'm curious if anybody's like, this person who can't stop looking at themselves in their phone screen has some interesting thoughts about stories, and maybe I want to see a story that they've written. You know, maybe. Just want to get a general sense of whether people would be into that.